Hi there, welcome to Lorena's Labyrinth, or welcome back, depending on where you sit within those parameters. If you don't know, I'm Anna Pirelli and I'm the business owner of Lorena's Labyrinth. Anyway, today we're going to be talking about the ruling number 2. This is obviously the second video on ruling numbers, and we'll be talking about the general specifics of people who have a ruling number 2, and we'll take a look at personality traits and a little bit more just to keep it interesting. Once again, it's a very general perspective. So just a reminder that all the ruling numbers, they are the sum of the numbers in the birthday, and they are totaled or added up and reduced down to a single primary number between 1 to 9, unless, there's a big quotation marks, unless they equate to the numbers 11, 22 or 33, in which case these numbers are said to be master numbers and they have a specific power associated with them based on the energy of the numbers. And we'll be talking about master numbers in a different video after we've done all the other ruling numbers. So anyway, back to the 2. Based on the Pythagorean concepts of numerology or numbers, the position is that they carry either masculine or feminine energy or vibration based on whether or not they're odd or even numbers. So the Pythagorean concept is that the number 2 is considered to be feminine. Colours that are Actually, let me rephrase this. Colours also, in fact, under Pythagoras, everything has got a masculine or a feminine aspect. But when it comes to the numbers, the even numbers are the ones that are considered to be feminine, and they are associated with silver. Masculine numbers are associated with gold because of this business of energy. So the reason why it's associated with silver is because it's also associated with intuition and the moon, whereas gold, being masculine, is associated with the sun. So anyway, we can deduce based on this logic that people, through the virtue of their birth, if they're born under a ruling 2, that they are intuitive, they're reliable, they're compassionate, and generally speaking, they're the peacemakers. They have an artistic flair. People with a ruling 2 are also extremely rare because there's only one way that a person can have a ruling number 2, and that is if the sum of their birth date totals the number 20. Any other combinations of 2 will actually add up to the number 11, which means they've got a master ruling number of 11. So anyway, we don't reduce the number 11 down in most numerological situations. Sometimes we do. But if you do have a number of 11, I recall a time, I'm just going to throw this bit in here, when I was a little deluded. This is back in the days, the early days, where it's like, oh my God, they've got a number 11 or a 22, they must be so amazing. And then I found out that actually I have ruling numbers and it doesn't mean amazing at all, despite the fact that it's associated with power, so they say. Actually, this is just me being cynical. This is because I have a 22 and a 33, and I can't say that it's made my life easier. And in fact, all the people that I've spoken to that have master numbers have really had some big life curveballs thrown at them. So anyway, I'll talk about the 33s and the 22s and the 11s in more depth when we talk about master numbers. But back to this particular 2, the 20, they are generally extremely sensitive, or they're like, because of this association with feminine energy and the moon, they're most likely, I should say, to be sensitive and emotional individuals, highly intuitive. They may struggle to make decisions because they've got very high expectations of themselves and are very concerned with the senses of right and wrong. And yes, it is possible for a person to have a day number of 2, but that is a separate video. We'll talk about day numbers after we finish the ruling numbers. So from a general perspective, the attributes of the ruling 2 is very clearly that they're likely to be aware of their path, even if they don't consider themselves to be particularly spiritual or awakened. They will carry a sense of purpose or responsibility within all their actions, and they will potentially take on more responsibility for things than they need to. The vibration of the number 2 is centered around judgment, which is to some extent about the desire to be approved of by those around them. Other people's opinions will matter, and so they like to live with an integrity this is when they're living upwardly. Their intuition will invariably help them to make right, and I say this right decisions based on their rational processing, logic, and conscious discernment or discrimination. So we're talking about their moral fibre. Being right and doing the right thing based on their morality is going to be very important to them. So the vibration is centered around, as I said, the judgment, the ability to assess and then make right decisions based on feelings, not based on rationale, but more based on feelings, and not necessarily about what's going on in their environment. It's about what they feel on the inside. It feels right, it feels moral, it feels just, so therefore I'm going to take X and Y actions. Now, part of their life path is about learning to make those healthy decisions and to follow their intuition. And the ruling 2, more than other people, have an ongoing cycle of life experiences of adaptation and change, rebirth and renewal, as well as raising awareness of what is false and what is real, and learning to focus and direct the power of their will. Now, this leads to, in general, wider choices and responsibilities. Nothing grows overnight. It's all part of the evolution of life and of the evolution of both the person in the physical sense and on a spiritual sense. So there's this continuation of organic and perpetual rebirth, if you like. Once they feel comfortable with their ability to make decisions, then they will feel more liberated and have a greater insight, not only into their lives, but their opportunities will expand. So the power of the 20 reduced down to a 2 vibrates to the patterns of time, endless and enduring. And anybody that's born under this particular vibration, their challenge is to learn to use their time wisely so that they can expand their own ways of thinking for the greater good of their soul, basically, and for the people, well, for themselves. So these comments here about their life purpose, they're made basically on my understanding of numbers and energy and the duality here, if you like. Not necessarily on practical experience. I'll explain that in a little minute why. But anyway, the life purpose for people with a ruling 20/2 is basically as a support role for a very dynamic leader, because while they do have leadership qualities and they're quite capable of leaders, they don't necessarily have the desire to become a leader. So this is because they can become lost in the responsibilities that leadership carries. So instead, where they probably work best is using their gifts and talents to complement said leader through providing support and intuitive wisdom. And what this can look like is when they're having a conversation with this dynamic leader, and the dynamic leader says, right, this is the plan, this is what we're going to do. Because the 20/2 has that intuitive capacity, and generally because they're motivated by care and regard for people as well, they can turn around and go like, right, okay, so we're thinking about this. Have you thought about the fact if we do X and Y, we are likely to meet with resistance in this area, and that could be quite difficult to manage. So then the leader will go, okay, good point, right? So then they can navigate implementing some of their ideas, if you like. Now, the other thing that's important about a 20/2 is that they don't tend to be motivated by ego, right? They're less motivated by ego, and they can be quite selfless in their support of their associations. There's a level of loyalty, I guess, attached to that, because integrity, when the 20/2 is upright, is actually pivotal to them. So they can be very loyal and selfless. They will generally merge and adapt their plans, whatever they're thinking of, to accommodate that of their leader or associates when necessary. They can be highly compassionate and sensitive, and because they like to be stable and reliable, they're well suited to become excellent peacemakers and reformers. Now, just a note, these are the attributes of the upward living number 2. And 20/2, as much as any other number, they have choices in how they live their life. And just because these are the attributes doesn't mean that they will live to their potential, or that they will live to their potential in ways that other people will value. But I can assure you, if the public turned, for example, on a 20/2 and judged them very harshly, and they would take it very personally, because it's important for them to be perceived well, and to be regarded highly by at least those people around them, if not the general public. So the advice for a ruling 2 is that they need to be left to work at things at their own natural pace, because this allows them to consolidate information as they process it. And when they are pressurised with urgency, they can become overly stressed and start to feel insecure and burdened. Now, they very much, I touched on this before, they dislike to have their integrity questioned, as this will undermine their confidence, and they're very reliant on their intuition to guide them into using their hands, actually, with sensitivity. Now, this can be in the creation of arts or writing. I'm actually quite interested to know, if you've got ruling 2s in your family, how this might apply, and if it's you that you're the one with the ruling 2. I'd love to hear your feedback on this. So the negative tendency that a ruling 2 will need to overcome, is the tendency to rely on logical thought processes as opposed to their intuition. Because if they start putting too much emphasis on material pursuits and egocentricity, then life's going to become very frustrating for them, because there is a higher risk that they're going to make some quite significant errors of judgment. The usual process is that a ruling 2 will actually work this out, usually fairly early, and then return back to their intuitive path. What I find very interesting here, and hopefully you will shortly when I close out this video, is that the suitable vocations for the ruling 2 is actually generally as administrative or executive support people, personal assistants, particularly within charitable organisations or teaching organisations. If they decide to gain work guided by their sensitivities into the arts, music, dancing, etc., which is where they will obviously feel more comfortable, it's unlikely that they will be the soloist or the star of the show, because they're more comfortable sitting in the background. Now, this is going to lead me to somewhere really, this is what I'm interested in. I've been holding back. I'm going to go straight for it. So as I said before, the ruling 2 is so rare that I actually have never met one, and I have never actually provided a numerological report to a person with a ruling 2. So I had to do my homework for this video, and these were the only ruling 2s that I could find. I like to use public examples because anyone can do their research on them and see how perhaps the information that I convey about the numbers, how that is actually played out or demonstrated in their life. So without further ado, let's take a look more so, I think, at Ronnie Corbett to start with. Ronnie Corbett's the bloke on the right. So if you don't live in England or United Kingdom or Australia or one of these kind of nations, you might not have heard of Ronnie Corbett, but certainly within my generation, everybody knew about the two Ronnies, actually, which were two comedians. Not Ronnie Corbett and Ronnie Barker, they had their own show. Ronnie Corbett was a very successful comedian back in his day, and he was able to use his talents to highlight life in hilarious ways. I think from a position of hindsight, if I look back, the reason for his success was because that the shows were actually really quite relatable, and while the programs did show absolute stupidity, I guess there was a humanitarian edge to it as well, because it highlighted if you like, the incongruous behaviours by people, and he could laugh at himself, I guess, because he was a funny looking little man and he was only 5'1", so he obviously was the butt of many jokes, and everybody was laughing at him. Now, he will have grown up at a time frame when it was common. We used to have a saying back then, if you can't laugh at yourself or whatever, laugh at yourself and the world laughs with you, and obviously this was part of his ethos, if you like. Anyway, as far as marks on the world go, he will always be remembered for his humour, But at the same time, my understanding is that he also suffered quite severe depression, although when I was doing the research for this video, it seemed to understate his depression. I remember back in the day that there was real issues about it. I think he took time off work for a while as part of managing his mental health. And I'm not 100% sure whether or not he struggled with addiction, because there is a report about him publicly using cocaine. Now, whether or not that was a one-off or not, I'm not really sure. But if you try and put things into perspective a little bit based on his age, he was quite famous in the 50s and 60s. And if anybody knows anything about the 60s, that was probably a massive year where methamphetamines, it was all prescription medication back then, feeling a bit stressed, pop a Valium, things like that. It seemed to be, they hadn't worked out the harmful consequences of all this substance abuse. I mean, obviously the focus was on reducing heroin use and LSD and that kind of stuff. That was getting a lot more publicity, but it took a bit longer for people to really recognise the impacts of addiction. So I don't know how that relates to him, but where I'm going, because I've distracted myself, I went down the rabbit warren, is from a political aspect. He didn't, as far as I know, become hugely involved in politics, but apparently towards the end of his life, he was involved with a lobby group trying to keep Scotland as part of the UK. So I think that's probably about all that I can say about him. Yeah, so I'm actually really interested in Regan based on the energy of the birth numbers that we've just talked about, with this affiliation between the ruling 2 and sensitivity, use of hands, intuitive guidance, and basically everything there says that you would not expect, is where I'm going, you would not expect somebody with a ruling 2 to end up as the leader or president of a massive nation such as the US. Now, there will be people that will turn around and question it as well, because people were very divided. They were either huge supporters of Regan and Maggie, or they were hugely hostile towards the pair of them. What I find interesting, so I'm just going to talk about this a little bit from the numerology perspective. So we all know that Regan actually reinvented himself a number of times. He was actually the product of an alcoholic father, I believe. The father, I think, was, if I'm correct, but I could be wrong, so feel free to put it up there. I think the father was more, which is atypical of the times, the working class were fighting for basic fundamental human rights, if you like. So there was a unionism that was involved in about the 1920s and 30s, and so that's not abnormal at all. But initially, Reagan took on board his father's viewpoints, and he was a supporter, apparently, of his father's policies. And then as time went by, he became less radical and became more of a conservative. At some point in time, he left home and he went and he became an actor. He got into his acting career, which we all know. Now, what I find interesting is looking back in hindsight of that, he was never credited, although he did a lot of movies. It was because he was a nice guy. Everybody liked him, apparently, but he was never credited with being a really good actor. So this kind of ties in with the number 2. He did not have an inflated ego, and he was not hung up about being the star of the show. He was quite happy to play, from what I can see, a supporting role. Then obviously he got married and divorced and that kind of stuff, and in 1952 he married Nancy. I'm just looking at my notes here because I made notes of this because I think it's quite interesting. So he married Nancy. Now, he married her in 1952, and I think I need to do a numerology report on Nancy at some point as well, because she's got some very interesting numbers there as well. But anyway, I would imagine what has happened is that she has probably persuaded him to pursue these more leadership person, look at me type roles, because apparently it was in 1966 that he became governor of California, and that was his entry into politics. So then from there, obviously, by the time he gets to president, that must have been some really intense marketing by somebody there. Thatcher, of course, had been in for a year. Now, the reason I'm referring to Thatcher is because she has got that 22-4. She has got the number of a visionary. She's also, in her numerology, she actually has a bit of a ruthless element. Now, most of us, whether we're into her politics or not, we will see that she did have a ruthless edge. She was very shrewd, actually. So, where I'm going with this is that based on her numerology, whether we agree with her politics or not, she was operating from her moral compass, and what she believed was right. That's where I will go with that. She thought what she was doing was the right thing. I remember actually that there are some politicians that I've seen in Australia and referred to and sort of said, well, I don't agree with their politics, but because I've actually heard them speak, I believe in their sincerity of what they believe in, even though I don't agree with their vision. And I think that's probably the same with Maggie Thatcher a lot. But anyway, I wanted to bring into the numerology here, like why, in Australia, what happened? Why didn't our leaders stand up against some of these appalling human rights actions that were going on with Thatcher and Reagan? And what we see here, I've totally reviewed whatever I might have thought about Malcolm Fraser. He's got a ruling number of 3. He is what is called a 3/3. Bob Hawke, who came in after him, and so Malcolm Fraser, he was Prime Minister of Australia until 1983. He was very much a conservative, and he would have been totally behind Maggie and totally aligned with Ronald Reagan at the time. Bob Hawke, on the other hand, he came in 1983, and he was Prime Minister until 1991. Now this is why it's all really interesting, he also has got a master ruling number, and he was in for a long time. We'll talk about 33 6s as well, but that the relevance for this slide is we're talking about how did Ronald Reagan, as a ruling 2, get to be this global leader. He was supported by a visionary, an activist. So instead of being the support person, he became the leader, supported by a visionary, a human rights activist. So they obviously shared a vision. His wife has power numbers. I just find it incredible. But I'm not sure, in all fairness, that it ended up being in his best interest, because the bottom line is the man got Alzheimer's, and he was like a puppet in the last years of his presidency. I did actually put down a whole heap of stuff here, but I'm going to buy, because otherwise it'll get too long. I would imagine that the pressure and stress that Ronald Reagan was under as president, operating outside of his comfort zone, not being allowed to follow his intuition or his own moral judgment and conscience, that this probably exacerbated, if not triggered, his mental decline. But of course, this is purely speculative. So I'm going to close on this video, I think, and just saying, so what we've learned today is that the ruling 2 is a support role. The 80s was massive. These people changed the face of the world, actually. It was at this stage that neoliberalism, if you use that term, when that came to the front. And this was about cutting back on social services and making government small. This is when they started privatising a lot of the previously held government services. If you, from what I know, and just going into stretch because I'm not American, the outsourcing of, say, the prison system, where it becomes private contracts and that kind of thing. We have done the same in Australia. Historically, these were government employees. They were government owned and government managed, but now we outsource them. We pay people to come and look after these contracts. We've privatised things like the provision of electricity and gas, telephone lines, all this stuff. This all happened in the 80s as part of their belief that the government should just be small and people should just be left to their own devices. So this was their vision. And in fact, you may as well say it was actually Maggie's vision And I'm not convinced that they would have been able to implement it as effectively if the US had also not been willing to support her, shall we say? Got to be careful what I say here. Okay, and certainly within Australia, Bob Hawke, he might have been a humanitarian and he was known to be a unionist and a socialist, but he just would not have been able to challenge these two. They're very powerful in their own right. So, what could the two achieve and what could the 22-4 have achieved for humanity if they had a different vision? Because I don't think that this is just my perspective. I haven't seen the quality of life improve for people since the 1980s. And although I did go to university and, my father's of that generation where he will turn around and say, oh, university, it's all full of commies, da, 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 da. Well, I'm not even going to answer that. But what I will say is the evidence and the stats do show that the best quality of life for people, as far as standard of living goes, was actually in the 1980s when they had, do your own research on this because I find this amazing. The quality of life was so good for many of us because the rich were paying tax. There was the highest tax rates, apparently, I think. No, look, I'm just going to leave that with you. You can go and do your research on that. But what we do know, obviously, collectively across globes, is that the quality, this business of the little man's working for less money and he's fighting harder to pay his rent and all of that kind of stuff, basically is just the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer. And this has all been the decline post Thatcher and Reagan as well. So, I'm not blaming them for it. This decline in the quality of life has been happening through the 1990s after both of these people came out. But there was a decline, in all fairness. There was a decline started for many people, I believe, in England in the 1980s. We didn't have it in Australia until the 1990s. The 1980s was still pretty good for us. It went a bit foul in the 1990s for most people. Now, you may have a different opinion. I'm just going to put this up there. You may have a different opinion, and that's fine. This is based on my experience and my observations, and tying this in with the ruling too. I think that, the power that these two had with me, with my 33-6 vision, I would have liked to have seen something that was more kind to the wider population. So anyway, folks, on those happy little notes and deep reflective thoughts and a little bit of homework for you if you feel like it, I'm going to say goodbye for now. I shall move along and get cracking on the next video. The next one, of course, is going to be the ruling 3. I was going to say I'm looking forward to that one, but not necessarily, because the 3 can actually probably have more contrast than other numbers. Anyway, so I do apologise for putting the emphasis on politics today, if that's not your thing that you're into. But I sort of think, wow, given the rarity of the number 2, it's actually very difficult to find somebody to talk to. But when you look at the influence, I just think it's incredible that a ruling 2 will have got to that level of government based on the fact that the energy is in total contrast to somebody who has, gone front of the stage, taken the limelight. They would have been so out of character for Reagan, actually, based on his numerology. So it's very interesting to see him out there. And as for Ronnie Corbett, I think, we see there that although he was famous, he actually always shared the stage with Ronnie Barker. So that's interesting. So in many ways, although he was a lead of the show, he was also a share lead. So it's fascinating. Anyway, for now, I shall leave this with you. Have a wonderful, glorious day. Take care, and I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.